So welcome everyone to this IES webinar, COP28 Reflections from Across the Sector. This webinar was organised by the IES Climate Action Community and features short presentations from members of the community and other members who attended COP28 to provide their reflections on some of the key outcomes of the conference in relation to different environmental topics, including the built environment, nature, food systems, air quality, and the ocean. I will introduce each of the speakers just before they provide their presentation, and at the end of all of the presentations, there will be a chance to ask questions. You can do this by submitting these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. If your question is aimed at a particular speaker, please do put their name in the question so I know who to address it to. So we'll kick off now. I'm really pleased to introduce all of our speakers. Thanks so much for joining us today. First up, we're going to hear from Robbie Epsom. Robbie is a member of the Climate Action Community and part of the IES delegation to COP28. As a sustainability leader within the built environment, Robbie's ambition is to harness the scale of the real asset management sector and foster collaboration across the whole value chain, with the ultimate objective of removing barriers and driving systematic and scalable solutions to accelerate the transition to a net zero and sustainable economy. Thank you for logging in. I will now hand over to Robbie. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Ethne, and thanks, IES, for having me today. Apologies if I come across a bit horsey. I'm sporting the January virus that many of us have. But good to see you all, and thank you for joining. And it's great to have the opportunity to present our findings, but also that IES gave us the opportunity to actually attend COP28 back in December last year. My name is Robbie Epsom. As Ethne said, I'm the EMEA Head of Sustainability at CBR Investment Management. And I also supported with leading the IES delegation into COP28. And I was there from the 4th of December to the 6th of December. So I covered the finance days and the built environment, which are important to me both professionally, but also two topics I'm very passionate about. I attended COP28 with a very firm IES hat on. But as Ethne said, my passion of attending these things is because they really are that gathering where you get to have the conversations with the people that can make the changes. Historically, COPs were very sort of process-driven events, and there wasn't much attendance from business. In my opinion, Glasgow changed that. So back at COP26, Glasgow was the COP where business started to show up. And that often is met with mixed reviews and reception. But in my personal opinion, if business isn't there, we can't activate the trillions that you often hear about in terms of investing in this change, both from a climate mitigation perspective and a climate adaptation perspective. So I think business needs to be there. They need to hear these findings, and they also need to be going away and taking those discussions back to their businesses and then enacting those changes and investing in the changes that need to happen. This COP was a big one, in my view. Many wrote that COP28 signaled the beginning of the end of fossil fuels, and that was very much the feeling that I had whilst I was there, and it'd be interesting to see what reflections my colleagues on this presentation have as well. It really was the first time that fossil fuels featured in the formal text, and what's so important, going back to that point on business, is that business was there to hear this discussion, and that was huge. This was something which was, we had a huge attendance from significant leaders from Paul Polman, ex-Unilever, Michael Bloomberg. You had PMs and leaders there from across the world. And what I think was actually really positive, and again, maybe I'm flipping something which a lot of the media saw as a negative, was that this conversation happened in a region that was heavily dependent and is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And that put that conversation in the heart of the problem, and the world's media and the focus of the world's media on that region. And I think that was very powerful. And actually, you had business leaders from around the world telling the Gulf countries that the economy is changing, it's pivoting in a different direction. And they, in my view, were listening to that. I was in rooms with the COP president, with other leaders from the Emirati team, and they were hearing these messages, and they were seeing that technology is evolving. This isn't just about dependence on fossil fuels. This is about technology and businesses moving in a different direction. They're not going to not listen to those warnings. So I think this, on the whole, was a very positive thing. But three things I wanted to pull out in my 5 to 10 minutes is, firstly, the global stock take. Secondly, the buildings breakthrough, a really important piece to my sector. and then a few wider highlights around the industrial decarbonisation strategy that the UAE launched. So firstly, the global stocktake, and I won't go into this in great detail, but this was the COP28 signaled the first UN global stocktake, and I think my colleagues will all say a bit more about this as well. This is the assessment for countries and stakeholders to see where they are collectively making progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And these findings were presented at COP28, and there was the formal text prepared in the GST to then summarize and effectively respond to that. In my view, that global stocktake, A, being presented, the findings, B, business being there to hear it, but that huge wake-up call that came out of that, where the view and the findings were that the world is not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think 2023 showed us plenty of substantiated evidence to that effect. This, in my view, was very much the catalyst that has led to fossil fuels finally, for the first time in I believe it's 30 years, being included in the text. So that was very powerful, and that was a big underlying theme for the whole of COP28, was that negotiation around the GST text. The second thing for me is the buildings breakthrough, and to me, arguably, this is the most exciting takeaway from COP28. COP26, there was a real gap in the breakthrough agenda, and that was buildings. And it's taken till COP28 to get that formally recognized as one of the breakthrough agendas. This is hugely powerful. The built environment, as you will have heard many times, makes up over 30%, if not more, of global greenhouse gas emissions, both through the construction and operation of buildings, and even more if you include infrastructure. So this is a very large part of the global greenhouse gas challenge, but also a huge part of the potential solution. The Buildings Breakthrough Agenda was launched on the Buildings Day, which I think was the 6th of December. And this is big because this puts the buildings sector, the built environment sector, at the heart of the COP discussions going forwards. This breakthrough agenda was signed by, I think it was 27 countries, including the UK, USA, China, Germany, and many other leading economies. And they've all agreed to make near zero emission and resilient, another key word in the sentence, buildings the new normal by 2030. So this is a huge commitment to work together on transitioning us to near zero emission and resilient buildings by 2030. So a real step forwards. And I think what was particularly exciting about this is it was launched with two supporting initiatives, one for concrete and cement, looking at low carbon concrete and cement. And again, that's a similar breakthrough agenda, but supporting that bigger buildings breakthrough agenda. And then secondly, one for sustainable wood and timber, making sure again that these materials in the construction sector are being sourced sustainably and are low carbon to help meet that transition to near zero emission buildings. A weakness there, if I were to pull out a weakness, is that we're seeing a lot of different definitions across Europe and the world for what a building looks like, near zero, zero emission, nearly zero, for example. And this sadly does add another definition to the mix. But the main thing here is there's a forum now to collaborate formally with countries across the world on transitioning towards zero emission buildings. So that was a big takeaway for me, and something that was very exciting to be in the room for as that was launched, and to then take that thinking back to trying to drive the agenda across the virtual city that we manage at CBRE Investment Management. And then lastly, to finish on some wider highlights, I was in the room for the launch of the industrial decarbonisation strategy for the UAE, focusing on their industry like aluminium, for example. This is a huge announcement, one that I didn't feel really hit the headlines enough, because to have a Gulf country launching an industrial decarbonisation roadmap is a very powerful statement. It's a shift towards low carbon aluminium, low carbon concrete, all the various things which they manufacture, and can only serve as a catalyst to bring other countries within the Gulf region, also heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on that same journey. The UAE also launched a declaration for global climate finance, a framework which will aim to mobilize private finance for climate action, again, pulling together that global desire to activate the trillions. So from my perspective, a very positive COP. I fully agree that this COP signaled the beginning of the end for fossil fuels. And I think there was a huge appetite from being on the ground, the engagement, the number of meetings I had with senior business leaders for positive change. And it's not an appetite for change from those that can't make the changes. This is an appetite for change from those that can go away and enact large systematic change within their organizations or invest in that change. So I leave feeling optimistic, and it'll be interesting to see what my colleagues on the panel discussion today also have to say. But I'll leave it there and look forward to answering any questions at the end.
Thank you so much for that, Robbie. Great to hear your positive view of what happened at COP28 and some of the reflections specifically around the built environment. So thank you so much for that. And to all our attendees, please do put your questions for Robbie in the Q&A box. Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Kripa Dwarakanath, a member of the Climate Action Community Steering Group and also part of the IES COP28 delegation. Kripa has over 19 years of postgraduate consultancy experience in sustainability strategy, including the last 10 years in climate change mitigation. Thanks so much for joining us, Kripa. Over to you.
Okay, right. So my reflections, before jumping on the last slide is exactly to reflect on, but as Robbie alluded to, it was quite a big event, but also it was what my observation was and what I heard from other people was probably this is the first when quite a lot of private players also were in that space. I wouldn't say in the room, but in the space. So it was not just like UN officials or country officials. So it had people from the wider industry as well participating, which is probably a huge shift from what it used to be a few years ago. And that itself meant there were quite a lot of events and quite a lot of interesting sharings in terms of experience, in terms of innovations and other things as well. But very quickly, I will try and go through the stock take as again, as Robbie has already mentioned. It was not the best like optimistic picture in terms of what in terms of progress, but that's something all of us all probably had already read when the UNFCCC report came before COP. But this was the first occasion, or COP28 was the first occasion to do that stock take in accordance, which was written in the Paris Agreement Article 14, like every now and then at a particular frequency that all countries will take stock. Yes, alarm and serious concern in terms of progress, in terms of particularly addressing the impacts to those who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and especially when they are not necessarily wholly responsible for, and also significant gaps in adaptation that was also highlighted. And another concerning one was that developed country parties failed to achieve their emission reduction targets between 25 and 40% by 2020. That was another not so good message or news within the report, but what it was in terms of, so that's the performance, if you like, and also in terms of finance, there were gaps that was noticed, which again, many of you probably had already read in the press, so probably I'm just repeating what it is, what you already probably have heard about, but it is the gap. And although it's the gap or the failure, if you like, in terms of mobilizing that $100 billion US dollars per year by 2020, that wasn't achieved when the stock take happened or when it was reviewed in 2021. But there was still some positive news in terms of mobilizing climate finance, and quite a lot of parties as well made pledge, or countries as well did make some pledges around climate finance, around investments in climate friendly projects, and so on and so forth. So this is quite a long list. I won't get into the details, but in short, from a climate adaptation point of view, the money is not sufficient. That was the key message. And there's an interesting development, probably the first for a COP, or if it had started last time itself, I apologize, but it's to do with artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence could be used, or could be, how could we explore or the role of artificial intelligence for climate action. So there were quite a number of events on this as well, which I did not attend. However, it was a big topic in itself, and my colleagues at GHD did run a few events, particularly with regards to artificial intelligence for the UAE. markets. So an outcome of that was what's called a technology mechanism initiative that's been proposed, and that will look at the artificial intelligence or the role of AI in particularly in helping least developed countries and small island states. But what it is, how it's going to come, and what are the things that will go into it. So that's a bit of a wait and watch, or probably some of us or all of us could be part of it. And the last, well, of course, last from my side, but there are plenty of others as well, is to do with when we think about climate change and the effects and response measures, it's very important to bear in mind the potential implications of that for people and jobs, especially, and in that context, just transition. So the link between any response measures to, in terms of climate mitigation response or climate adaptation response, mostly climate mitigation response, one should think about just transition as well. So it's not literally like shut the shop, for example, and people on the workforce are out of jobs. So the transition has to be very well thought through. Economic diversification, for example, should be thought through, and it could be different for different countries and their circumstances and so on. But that emphasis was made within the GST document as well. So these are some details. I won't get into all the details. I'm happy to share the slides later. But the most important things for me was to do with mitigation and the need to deploy deep, rapid, and sustained reductions, emission reductions. There's a list of things that countries could do in terms of renewable energy generation, low carbon hydrogen, which again, GHD did quite a lot of events around that. But some of those are a bit like a question mark. I mean, it wasn't really clear, for example, around what's called a transition fuel or transition away from fossil fuels, and how is that going to be achieved? That wasn't very clear. But methane emissions or reduction in terms of methane emissions has found its place as well, which is good, but again, there are questions around, well, it's a greenhouse gas anyway. So there's a bit of like question mark around, or uncertainty or less clarity around what those things mean. But in short, phasing down of unabated coal power, renewable energy generation, and accelerate low emission technologies. Those were the key messages. But other than the whole carbon energy picture, what was interesting to see was how they made the connection, at this time, COP28 made the connection to the Kunming-Montreal Protocol of the Global Biodiversity Framework 2030. And it's now presented a holistic picture that the climate change and biodiversity loss, they are double crisis. It's a double crisis, and it's impossible to address one without the other. It both in terms of climate change, how climate change could affect biodiversity loss, and the other way around as well, how biodiversity losses could affect adaptation, for example. So the GST and in general, the whole conversation was around how it is important to take a comprehensive and a synergistic approach to climate change mitigation measures, as well as adaptation as well. But there were a number of other discussions around capacity challenges with regards to least development countries, small island states, climate finance, access to climate finance. But I'll see if I can come into that in a minute. But the adaptation piece itself, there were some decisive targets, if you like. But if you look at the targets itself, they seem more like a set of guidance than targets. That's around, let's say, water scarcity, climate resilient food, agricultural production supply, health mitigation against health impacts, or ecosystem-based, nature-based solutions, increasing resilience of infrastructure and human settlements. So that whole list there was listed as like targets to achieve by 2030. However, it lacks detail in terms of, what does that mean in terms of numbers or so on. But there is a follow-up text to that, which says more of a, so there will be indicators that will be developed by what's called a UAE, I think I'm pronouncing this right, BELEM work program. So that's been launched as well, who will develop indicators to measure progress against these adaptation action targets that's been proposed. So that was another big one for me to take away and probably follow up quite a lot with UAE BELEM work program and the progress of it. I spent quite a lot of time at the Commonwealth Pavilion as well to understand the issues relating to least developed countries as well as small island states. And the days I was there was nature and youth. So the programs, obviously, quite a lot of them were on that topic. What was interesting to see was at the front end, where people were talking about climate finance and big numbers, trillions and billions not being available. But at a ground level, when I was at the Commonwealth Pavilion, it was more to do with capacity or lack of capacity or lack of understanding of those terminologies and so on, that they are unable to write a very convincing application for funding. So that, and then how it is important for them to be trained in capacity building and how youth should get engaged and so on. So it was interesting to see both parts of this climate finance issue. To witness that was an eye-opener for me. In terms of, very quickly, in terms of way forward or actions and pledges, there was something called Roadmap to Mission 1.5. That's been, or it's been launched. I was trying to find further information on that, which you may also want to find. But I think more details are yet to come around what that roadmap could look like. But there was another important one, which was the Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program that ran for 2 years around developing a goal on climate adaptation. So that concluded, and it's now been adopted as a UAE framework for global climate resilience. And within that, there are proper targets to achieve by 2030 around impact, vulnerability, and risk assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation and learning. So all of these, of course, they relate to a country level, but it doesn't happen in isolation, right? So it works in how the systems operate and so on. But that was an interesting and a useful takeaway point for me. How does that then roll down in terms of the work that we do? I'm going to pause, very quickly jump, because again, a few text around climate finance and so on, because I would like to spend a bit of time on the climate nature nexus. It was again interesting to see how nature has now made its way into these climate mitigation adaptation actions from around 55 countries in their NDCs and in their documents. Have out of 97 NDCs, nationally determined contribution documents, 55 have recognized the role of nature. So it just goes on to say how you can't start. It's impossible to talk about these two topics separately. And I also already touched on the Kunming-Montreal GBF protocol, and that's now become central or kind of embedded within COP in the COP conversation, which was great to see. But there were a few interesting suggestions as well in terms of halting and reversing deforestation through investments, technology transfer, but also the documents, they talk about results-based payments, incentive provisions. The conversation is now moving, although it's not 100% in terms of actions, suggestions on what the actions could be is present there, which was good to see. But again, it depends on how each country wants to take it and run and translate that. That's a different story. But in short, climate adaptation has to be implemented in an integrated fashion. Multi-sectoral solutions need to be It's in a synergistic way. For example, take land use management and then climate and then nature and ecosystem. So they're all integrated or interrelated. So that holistic thinking or systems thinking, which again at IES, we've been talking about quite a long number of times. And that's what essentially I saw at COP as well, which was quite reassuring. Finally, before I finish, one important one was the recognition or the text around indigenous people's knowledge. So I think till last year or previous years, there was only science, best available science. That was the text, but now it's best available science and indigenous people's knowledge. So that recognition again, that knowledge that people have by developing a connection with nature has made its way. That was quite rewarding to see. And then quite a lot of conversations around, or meetings, if you like, around Nature Positive Initiative, which again, some of you might have come across, but I will leave you to go and browse and find a bit more about. But finally, to end, nature and nature-related risks and how important it is to think about nature in the context of mitigation and adaptation. The role of Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures was also something that was very well discussed, and quite a lot of events and sessions around that. I'm just going to finish here. I think I've already kind of communicated the various observations that I had made, but in terms of reflections, it was a massive venue. To go from one place to another, you would miss the first 10 minutes of the session. That was one thing. But yes, actions have been expressed, as I suggested in my previous slides. The actions have been identified, but not necessarily, I would say, they're demanding enough. It could have been a bit more concrete, a bit more demanding, but at least there is a commitment to develop indicators. Let us see what that looks like, or what that'll look like maybe in 2 years' time, to see if that has worked. In terms of climate finance, yes, there are some gaps which I think needs to be seriously filled, and how that will work is yet to be seen. So, but the one positive thing I would take, or the message I took away from here, from COP, was gets the next generation involved as much as possible. And then that was reiterated several times, and it's got embedded in my head now, in the context of both technical or technology and involvement, but also in terms of finance and help them take the lead. It's very important that we bring the next generation into the conversation, make them allies rather than the way it has been so far. So that to me was the key takeaways or reflections. Just to finish off, that photograph on the right, I don't know if you can see, it was a Canadian minister. These are the things that you could see as well. So as I was walking, there was this little crowd. What was happening, because the Canadian minister was announcing cap on oil and gas related emissions by 2030, I think. So that was quite interesting as well. So a lot of events were happening in parallel, and it was brilliant actually to be on there. Thank you so much, IES, for that opportunity as well.
Thank you so much, Kripa. That was a really interesting presentation, looking at how we can, how COP28 focused on thinking about how we can develop, how we can address both biodiversity and climate change together. So thank you so much for that. Once again, to all our attendees, if you have any questions for Kripa, please do put this in the Q&A box. I'm now pleased to introduce our third speaker today, Dr. Uchenna Onyezu, also a member of the Climate Action Community Steering Group and part of the IES COP28 delegation. Uchenna is a chartered environmentalist, university lecturer, and currently on secondment to the IFAD-funded Livelihood Improvement Family Enterprises Niger Delta project as the project state coordinator. Thank you so much, Uchenna. Over to you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. So my reflection will work specifically on food systems and agriculture, to talk a little of what actually happened during the COP28. For me, it was my first experience with the COP, the COP that happens every year. And of course, we know that COP28 happened in Dubai. I attended towards the last 2 weeks of the event, and specifically on food systems. We all know that climate change is creating severe pressure and risk on the food systems globally. And at this recent COP28 in Dubai, governments around the world met and assessed global efforts towards addressing climate change impacts, including the agri-food sector. And during this period, critical negotiations were made at the conference. They were addressing loss and damage financing. They also addressed a global goal on financing as it affects developing countries, energy, and the just transition from fossil fuel to cleaner energy, closing the emission gaps, and the issue about negotiating on the first ever global stock take to address the progress made so far on the Paris Agreement. Most of the issues about the global stock take has been mentioned by my colleague. Of course, like I said, this particular COP28 focus was the first time food was seen as a key issue to be discussed. And on the 10th of December, 2023, during the conference, food and agriculture was the main thing that was discussed throughout the whole day. And this demonstrated the urgent need to prioritize what we called climate positive food. Of course, we all know that 30% of the greenhouse emissions, they all come from food production. Of course, the preparation towards COP28 and most of the activities that happen at the pavilions, at the sections, around the whole conference center demonstrated how food systems took the center stage in most notable decisions that took place during the conference, with at least 6 notable outcomes that could drive transformational change within the agri-sector around the globe. One of the first major outcomes that took place within food systems was that over 159 countries signed the COP28 UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems, and Climate Action. This declaration committed these nations above these 159 countries to scale up adaptation, resilience actions for farmers, rural farmers, for fishers or fishermen, and food producers. This also worked to promote food security and nutrition through social protection systems, school feeding programs, and many more other things, other social networks. And also to support workers in agriculture and food systems to maintain what we call inclusive and decent work environment. For me, though these declarations this particular declaration that took place is not legally binding, it is powerful enough to send positive signals, especially in ensuring that different countries mainstream food systems into their key national and subnational plans and actions. For the second outcome that addressed food system issues was the time food appeared in the global stock take and the global goal on adaptation. For the first time, or for the first ever global stock take that was taken, this assessed the world's progress on climate action to date, setting up a roadmap for the future, which was agreed by the nation at the end of this COP28. The stock take outcome sent a very strong signal that agriculture and food system is now vital to the global response to climate change. So for me, this was an opportunity for everybody to discuss about the food system with regards to our responses to climate change. The third outcome that came out as a result of the discussions on food system was the launching of Alliance of Champions for Systems Transformation. And this took place on that December 10, 2023, that very day that food system was given this special focus. This high ambition coalition on food was led by Norway, Brazil, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and Cambodia. And for this coalition, it aims to drive ambitious implementation of the food systems agenda in these countries, working across 10 priority intervention areas. And for me, and for many others too, this is expected to be cascaded to other countries as they join or form similar coalitions. The fourth outcome that we experienced was the UN Food and Agriculture Organization releasing her global roadmap for sustainable food system. This roadmap tends to work to enable the global temperature rise limit to be within the 1.5 degrees centigrade. It also sets sustainable agenda for crop and livestock production, reducing agricultural greenhouse emission and builds some level of resilience. This roadmap is also expected to reduce food losses and waste. Of course, we know that, especially in developing countries, we experience a lot of food loss after harvest and food waste. So we hope that this roadmap will be able to reduce that significantly. It will also help to shift diets in rich countries, or what we call developed countries, away from consumption of meat to more of consumption of plant-based foods. The fifth outcome that came out was that non-state actors, which are mainly the non-governmental organizations and private organizations or private institutions, committed to act on food systems. And in doing this, within the conference, over 200 non-state actors coming from different types of companies, private organizations, farmers, indigenous peoples, they committed to act on food systems in a call to action as facilitated by the UN Climate High-Level Champions. The sixth, but not the least, outcome that came out was that more finances was promised for food system solutions. And doing this, governments, foundations, and other committed financial institutions committed to sustainable food systems. For us, what comes next after all these outcomes? Of course, we know that some of the achievements on food and climate at COP28 now rest on the urgency and transparency of delivery of some of these outcomes by different stakeholders. The achievements by these nations, companies, philanthropies, and other actors will be measured going forward as subsequent COPs. For example, the next COP, which is COP29, which will happen at Azerbaijan, and the next subsequent COP at Brazil will also be used to measure whether we are making progress or not. In summary, for me, and from the experience I got from this attending the COP28, it saw a long-awaited and substantial progress on food and climate. Now, it is the world's collective responsibility to deliver on these promises and to ensure that this truly is a turning point for the food system and security at all levels. And when I mean at all levels, I mean at local levels, at national levels, subnational levels, and global levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uchenna. That was really useful to hear about some of the key outcomes that relate to food systems and climate action. So thank you so much for that. And again, please do put your questions for Uchenna in the Q&A box. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Chris Hazel Marshall. Chris is a member of the IQM Climate Change Working Group and is the air quality technical lead for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and has expertise covering emissions inventories, dispersion modelling, impact assessment, ambient monitoring, abatement, mitigation and project design. Thanks, Chris. Over to you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Christy Hazel-Marshall. I work for Environmental Resources Management. My background is in air quality, and I was invited to attend COP28 by the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. So very much my two angles going to COP28 were on carbon capture and the role of carbon capture in decarbonisation and future energy, and also air pollution and air quality as a sustainability goal in its own right, and also a key factor in the delivery of decarbonised society. So the overall impressions I'll come on to first, which is on the left-hand side on this. The energy was palpable, very positive vibe from a lot of people we were speaking to. Some of the other speakers have already touched upon the fact that perhaps some of the text was felt to be too watered down. The commitments were not legally binding, but there was a real positivity about the fact of some of the things that made it in there. The fact that we've got fossil fuel commitments in for the first time, hydrogen's mentioned for the first time, carbon capture is mentioned for the first time. So a real sense of being a game changer. The other comment that was made previously was about business being there, and that was really evident right throughout the 4 days that I was at COP28, that this was very much focused on the support of industry and business to government and to the global economy in actually delivering these things. Finance ran all the way through every conversation about access to money, about how to put that money into places where it's going to make a difference. The discussions were less about can climate change be solved and much more focused on the how to solve it. There was a couple of really significant things that rolled out of this. One was the great evidence of, let's call it the second generation carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and the like, that this is no longer about bench testing, it's no longer about pilot plants, it's about large scale delivery of means to address climate change. It was significant that we had an ammonia fueled ship turn up in port as a demonstration of what can be done. There was a lot of discussion about large scale and wide scale decarbonisation strategies using hydrogen and emerging fuels, and from some really significant countries as well. So the comments have been made around the Gulf states. I'd echo that as well. For Saudi, they were very much on message around wanting to diversify away from their oil and gas industry and go and do other things, and very much putting in place their strategy for not only decarbonising their existing industry, but also diversification of their industry into the net zero space. And that was very much supported by big business that was there. We've got a lot of focus on meeting the world's future energy needs. Energy was seen very much as a keystone to all of this. There is a real appetite for diversifying away from fossil fuels right across the world, no matter who I was speaking to, whether it was developed nations, whether it's emerging economies. Some of these emerging economies are very much seeing this as an opportunity to become serious stakeholders in the new energy world in a way that they've not done before. I was sat in on a conversation and a presentation done by the Angolan delegation, and they were looking at the opportunities that they have in country for hydropower, for solar power, for wind power. Their big barrier to enabling them to become a major supplier of global net zero energy is investment in infrastructure. So again, this comes down to finance and freeing up the cash to go and do these projects. But when you look at what the opportunities they've got, they're on the Congo River, second biggest river by outflow in the world. Vast amounts of space, vast amounts of resources that are going untapped at the moment. And they're getting quite excited about the prospect of being able to step forward as the new energy economy in Africa and see themselves very much as a leader in that space. And they're not the only emerging nation that are doing that. Very interesting presentation by the Brazilian delegates from essentially the Commerce Department, talking about how Brazil is going to set itself up as a carbon negative provider of liquid fuels to the world based upon their emerging and growing biofuels market. Now, of course, this is all nuanced around what are the law of unintended consequences. So clearly biofuels, there is a place in the world for consideration of that, but at what cost? We don't want to be chopping down rainforest in order to grow more biofuels. We don't want to be destroying natural habitat and destroying biodiversity to put in solar farms and wind farms, etc., or putting in hydro projects in the wrong place and designed to the wrong specification that is going to have knock-on effects. And this comes on to one of the key points that I was taking out of this, was that a lot of this was seen as climate change as a Western problem. A lot of emerging economies still have other issues that need to be dealt with within the 17 sustainability goals. You know, when you're talking to an Angolan delegation, so 60% of our population don't have access to sanitation, clean water, power, health, education. You realize that for a lot of the countries that are not as well developed as the Western world, which is very much focused on climate change, there are more immediate problems and more demanding problems that need to be addressed. And one of the key parts to this is going to be provision of energy. Now, that energy may come from initially lower carbon solutions. So there was a big push on natural gas, for example, to be the transition fuel, moving away from coal and going to natural gas. Clearly, there are implications of that, but combined with things like carbon capture and storage in other parts of the world where it can be done with direct air capture, there are opportunities that exist to have an overall net CO2 balance. So rather than getting rid of CO2 altogether, recycling CO2, reusing CO2, take it from one place to another, using the atmosphere as that transport mechanism. So there was a lot of ideas going on. There was a lot of thought about how to do this, about how to support emerging economies that need access to energy, that have huge growth in terms of energy demands and the need to look after the basic needs of a population before they come and address things like climate change. And as it's come on to this final point, that there are 17 sustainability goals, not just one. And that was something that very much rung through for me, talking to particularly the less developed nations and the delegations from those who said we've got bigger problems than climate change right now, which is not an angle that's necessarily brought out very strongly in Western media, which tends to focus very much on climate change. Over on the other side, we'll talk about carbon capture and storage and the air quality takeaways sort of with this aspect. Air quality was not mentioned in a topic as its own right. It's more seen as an endpoint that needs to be managed, not a driver in itself. When you consider, for example, World Health Organization, the new air quality standards that were launched a couple of years ago, we've got 99% of the world's population live in areas that don't comply with those standards. Air pollution is very much seen as a big issue. WHO have got it up there second behind climate change as a threat to human health, but it's not in itself being seen as a driver at COP28. It's not something that's being addressed as a specific issue, but it's being considered as one of the outcomes of everything else that needs to happen. One of the points that did cause me quite a lot of concern, the third bullet point on here, which is a very low awareness of the law of unintended consequences. In the past, what's been good for climate change has tended to be good for air pollution. One of the exceptions to that was things like biomass and Dieselgate, for example, the move over to diesel engines. But in the main, things that are good for climate change have tended to be good for air quality. However, we do have some of these emerging net zero technologies, carbon capture, hydrogen production, ammonia as alternative fuel, all of which potentially have big implications for air quality, human health, and ecology. With things like acid deposition, nutrient nitrogen deposition being key around pollutants like ammonia. So potentially we're going to a situation where we're so focused on climate change that other things are going to be impacted, other negative impacts are going to come across. This is going to be a really, really strong focal point and needs to be a strong focal point going forward. And that was one of the messages that I took away from some, but not all of the discussions we were having, was that we need to be aware of what these other things are doing. Previous speakers talked about biodiversity, and that was something that came through quite strongly, was the need to manage biodiversity, make the most of nature, and have these solutions in there alongside climate change, resolving climate change, so that we're not destroying one thing for the benefit of another and just creating another problem down the line. I think going forward, that's going to be very much a key focus point of, are we just batting the gopher on the head on one hole for something to pop up somewhere else? And actually that these need to be done in the round. All these problems need to be managed in the round. There's a need to bring up these developing nations and address some of the most basic needs that they have, particularly focusing on energy and energy delivery. How is that going to be achieved? Is it truly going to be achieved in the context of net zero for those countries, or is it more fair that Western nations, which have caused most of the problem, should be addressing those problems and allowing those emerging nations to be coming up without having the penalty of the additional cost of having to decarbonize at the same time? Questions that are being asked, not necessarily questions that are being answered. But just coming on to sort of the last point I took away from this was the recognition both of the huge opportunities that exist, but also the huge challenges. And the opportunities was the bit that really, really stuck out for me, really chimed. This wasn't a COP that was all about defining the problem and how big the problem is and how complicated the problem is and how hard the problem is. It was also a COP that was talking about how big the opportunity is, the technology that is coming from the bench and the laboratory to the pilot plant to the big rollout. Sat in a session with the Saudis where they were talking about a transport-based carbon capture system that they can bolt on to existing ships that are running on diesel to suck the CO2 straight out of the exhaust. They then go into port, they refuel with diesel, unload the CO2. Their point was, this is not an enabler for future fossil fuel exploitation. This is an enabler for swift decarbonisation of a sector that's going to take a long time to decarbonise. The lifespan of some of these ships is 25, 30 years. They're looking at this and saying, this is something we can do straight away. This is retrofit. It's easy. It's a minimal amount of changes to these vessels. We can put this out on the fleet. This was Saudi Arabia saying this. This was a nation that until recently was very much in the throes of climate change denial and wanting to focus on their fossil fuel industry. Completely flipped around now, and what they were saying and the vibe that was coming from the Saudi delegation was really positive about making the most of their opportunities. We've seen the comments previously in this meeting around UAE, around Qatar, around the Gulf states, making this huge change from oil and gas and recognizing something else. And that's come through in a lot of the conversations that I had, was the opportunity, and particularly the opportunity that's been delivered by business coming in and putting finance against this and putting money against this and seeing where the new thing can be. So not just talking about the negatives, but talking about the positives and talking about how to turn this into economic growth, economic development, opportunities to change how businesses are operating, pushing back up into governments. That was a real difference this time around, and a really, really positive thing that came out of this COP for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really good to hear your kind of positive feedback from the conference, specifically around the kind of focus on solutions, but also tempering that with the importance of awareness around unintended consequences of different measures. So thank you very much for that. Last but certainly not least, I'm really pleased to introduce Chelsea Baker. Chelsea is a research scientist at the National Oceanography Centre with 9 years experience researching the global ocean carbon cycle and how it may change under future climate change. Thanks so much, Chelsea. Over to you.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Right, let me just share my screen. So yeah, I'm Chelsea Baker. I'm a research scientist at the National Oceanography Centre, and this was my first time at COP. So we were there from the 8th to the 11th of December. And actually we were there on Nature, Land and Oceans Day. And this was already a big step forward for the ocean, that it actually had a specific day in which it was partly Oceans Day. So that was really exciting. And while we were there, we spent most of our time in the Ocean Pavilion, and this was put on by lots of partners coming together. So that was sort of research institutes, industry, non-profit organizations to put this pavilion on. And actually before COP even kicked off, these partners signed a Dubai Declaration for the Ocean. And this was really focused around global ocean observations for equitable knowledge-based decision making. And that was a theme at COP, but actually while we were there, there was a really hot topic that even sessions that weren't necessarily intended to talk about it ended up talking about ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And this is a climate mitigation solution. It's one aspect to it. And that's actually the flavor that I'm going to stick to for my reflections, because almost every session in the Ocean Pavilion ended up talking about it. But before I move on to that, a couple of other things I wanted to highlight is that one of the main points that was mentioned in the Dubai Declaration for the Ocean was to try and get ocean observations to feed into the global stocktake. So at the moment, there are not enough ocean-related aspects fed into the global stocktake, and that was one of the key ambitions for this COP, to try and raise the profile of the ocean in that sense. And also one of the key sort of successes, I guess, for the ocean was that there were more mentions of the ocean in the COP text than ever before. So we have the ocean is on the agenda. It's a big part of regulating our climate. And so it was good to see that it was getting a bit more attention than it's had at previous COPs. So that was really great. But yeah, so as I said, ocean-based carbon dioxide removal was the hot topic while we were there. And so I thought I would just give you a bit of background and talk about some reflections from that a little bit more. So just to give some wider context for those who aren't familiar, what is carbon dioxide removal? It's a deliberate human activity to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably store it away from the atmosphere. So this can be done by storing it in vegetation on land, in soils, but it can also be in the coastal and ocean environments. And so the marine-based carbon dioxide removal refers specifically to when carbon dioxide removal takes place in a marine environment. So it doesn't necessarily have to be stored there, but it has some interaction with the marine environment. And just quickly as well, although I'm sure we're all familiar, why are people looking at this? Well, why do we need carbon dioxide removal? The IPCC said that whilst it cannot substitute for immediate and deep emissions reduction, which is what we need first and foremost, all modelled scenarios to limit global warming to below 2 degrees or lower by 2100 require carbon dioxide removal. So you can see that this is our sort of remaining emissions. We have this slope, but we need some negative emissions if we manage to stay below 2 degrees. And this was echoed by the emissions gap report that was published not long before COP28, which they call broken records. So it says temperatures hit new highs, yet world fails to cut emissions again. And they also stress that under current or planned emission reduction efforts, the expanded use of carbon dioxide removal is unavoidable if the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal is to remain within reach. So there's lots of motivation to explore different routes and venues, if you like, for carbon dioxide removal. And actually, I was sort of smiling to myself when the other panelists have stressed that sort of business and industry was a really big presence here. We were sort of, the NOC delegation was asking a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question to ourselves of, so what first attracted you to the prospect of $1 trillion CDR industry? There's huge potential here for sort of private companies to make money. So it's thought that not just the ocean, but generally the CDR industry could be worth $500 million to $1 trillion per year. And so there was huge interest, and there is huge interest in this space. And one way to sort of demonstrate this interest is to look at this huge number of different reports and sort of best practice guides that have come out in the last few years. But first, to highlight why people are so interested in the ocean, it covers 70% of the planet, and it's the largest active carbon sink, and it stores more than 50 times more carbon is stored in the ocean than the atmosphere. So there's huge potential there, there's huge scalability options. And so different approaches are being explored. So some of them are sort of fertilization of the ocean. So you promote algae growth, they sink down, and then they store carbon. There's sort of ecosystem recovery and blue carbon type approaches. So that's sort of conservation and restoration of, say, mangroves, salt marshes, etc. And other more chemical approaches. So this alkalinity enhancement is often described as kind of adding antacid to the ocean. So it helps the ocean take up more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so there was huge interest, and it's really been gaining momentum over the last few years. And that was really apparent in the Ocean Pavilion. Even sessions that were focused on something else, questions ended up being asked in relation to carbon dioxide removal, and it felt like all paths led back to this aspect of sort of ocean research. So sort of reflecting then on the ocean at COP, and particularly while we were there for those 4 days. So the attractions for carbon dioxide removal are the scale of uptake, the scale of the storage, and the durability of storage. So it's how long carbon can be stored for. And in the ocean, this can be sort of centuries to millennia, depending on the approach. And what we did here while we were there is that there's lots of other considerations about these different approaches and deployment strategies. So there are ecological impacts. For example, if you promote growth in one place, you may rob nutrients downstream, and so then you may not have had a net effect of actually storing carbon overall. You have to consider the efficacy, so the effectiveness of the different approaches, and also the scalability. So one example here would be if you need to mine olivine for one of the approaches, and you have to grind it up and transport it to somewhere you're going to deploy it, you need to do a life cycle analysis of the carbon emissions to get to the point where you deploy, and then make sure that the action that you're taking does take up more carbon than what you've already created to get to that point. And also, you know, how much material is available, what are the energy requirements, and are there suitable locations where these resources are that you can deploy near where it'll be effective. So there's lots of considerations around that. One of the things that we also did hear a lot about is what's called monitoring, reporting, and verification. So this is, if you imagine doing a deployment, you would monitor to make sure that you've actually taken up additional carbon, but also what are the downstream ecological impacts of this. In terms of reporting, it should be transparent. You know, the data and things like that need to be made available to the community. And there needs to be some verification that ideally from an independent body, that you've stored the carbon that you've said you had, and that it's going to stay there for a climate relevant timescale. There's lots of complexities around this, and we heard a bit about this, about the governance and regulation. There's lots of transboundary issues in the ocean. If you deploy in an exclusive economic zone, but the ocean waters move, then either the carbon uptake and storage or some of the ecological consequences can be outside of that area. And so there's sort of legal and permitting issues and discrepancies there. And also the human dimensions. These actions may have unintended consequences and could impact society in various ways. And so while we were there at COP, we heard lots about this, but we also heard sort of a lot of I guess, arguments being put forward about urgency and pace, that we have to act now. You know, governance and decision making is too slow, so we have to progress ahead. We don't have time to wait for peer review. So there are lots of sort of real pushes that we have to start acting now. And in fact, even the precautionary principle, which usually states that we need to have good scientific evidence to understand the risks before we take an action, was sort of inverted to say that the climate change risk is already so high that we we have to actually act to take out this carbon dioxide removal now anyway. So it's very interesting to hear these different angles from different groups. There, of course, as was mentioned by some other panelists, there are opportunities and benefits. So there may be benefits to communities that are already impacted by climate change. There can be economic benefits and jobs, and this area has received a large amount of public, commercial, and philanthropic investment. I think our main takeaways as sort of the NOC delegation from COP were that we really do need impartial research. There's lots of unknowns about these different approaches. And ideally, before any deployments go ahead, we really need to understand how effective they are, what the consequences are, and what scale they can be effective. We need some research trials. There's definitely going to be feedbacks and unknowns that we just don't know about yet, and we won't know until we trial them. And then these results would feed back into modelling. So that's sort of looking at what the local impacts might be, but also up to Earth system scales. How scalable could these different approaches be? And it's really important that all research is open and transparent, not just sort of journal articles, but any data that's generated from trials by companies as well, if we really want to progress this rapidly. But overall, I think we were conscious that, and we'd like to highlight that we really need scientific integrity. We're not here and we don't want to advocate for any approaches, but this is right in the thick of sort of ocean biogeochemistry, carbon cycle, observations and modelling techniques are going to be required to assess these approaches. And so we need to make sure that we are using our expertise where it's appropriate to help either rule out approaches that just aren't feasible or aren't safe, or say, actually, this one is effective and could be put forward. And so really we need to, as scientists, do what we can to sort of make sure we have safe, just and equitable implementation of any ocean-based mitigation solutions that are effective. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea. Really useful to hear an overview of some of the kind of ocean-based carbon solutions, climate solutions, and some of the key areas that need to kind of be mobilized to achieve some of those. So thank you so much. If all of our panelists wouldn't mind turning on your cameras, we're going to go straight into the Q&A session, as we've already had a lot of questions in. So to kick off, we've got quite a general question, which is reflecting on all of your presentations. There's obviously been a lot of positive progress in a lot of areas, and a lot of positive ambition in different areas. But what do you think we can do to keep progress moving between COPs, recognizing the pace and urgency needed and making sure that we're actually delivering on some of these ambitions? Is there a particular panelist who'd like to go first on this one? Chris.
I can take that. I think one of the big points that has come out of this, and Robbie mentioned this as well, is the advent of business coming into the COPs from Glasgow. If you pull back from COP and look at the macro picture, we've now got the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We've got carbon border adjustment mechanism coming into the European Union. Australia, Japan, China are all looking at tax mechanisms for adjusting for carbon impacts and carbon footprints on these sort of things. Alongside that, you've then got industry and business are starting to look at this through a different lens. They're starting to see this as opportunity, not challenge. They're starting to very much see this as an opportunity to diversify and grow in whatever sectors that they're working in. And that momentum is beginning to really take hold and push this forward in a much different way. Hearts and minds are the hardest things to change. And that seems to be where COP's been for a long time. It's trying to change hearts and minds. And now you're seeing this all being put onto the basis of finance. Once you've got money talking, and you've got finance, and you've got economy, and you've got the banks getting involved, whilst it sounds a little bit, it can be a little bit turgid, actually, it puts it onto a footing where it aligns with what else is going on in the world. The entire world is based on economy and money. That's been the really big change over the last couple of years. And I think that in itself is now driving forward the momentum between the COPs, because there is an opportunity, there is an incentive at every level to go forward and do this.
Thank you, Chris. Robbie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think just to add to it, the role of COPs now is to give strong signals as to the direction of travel. And I think COP28 did that very effectively with the inclusion of the various texts relating to fossil fuels and in the formal text. Almost business doesn't need something to happen, it needs a signal that something's going to happen. And when they get that signal, business is able to start to invest on the back of that. So net zero is a good example. When that started to come into national policies, net zero 2050 or sooner, businesses and local economies started to act on that, because you don't want to leave things to the last minute. That's not good business sense. Getting that very strong signal that this is the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. And to Chris's point as well, I also witnessed delegations from Gulf countries discussing that very openly, and actually been moving way beyond that kind of climate denial stage into actual practical things that they could do to shift away. And those signals that this is going means that business will then inevitably start to look for how they can move forwards with this and how they can get on with it. And I think, again, building on Chris's points, the majority of the real world economy, things that are traded, bought, sold, consumed, combusted, is individuals and private companies, big and small. And things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that piece requires policy. Policy evolves out of things like COPs. But really the actual implementation, the real world change that needs to happen is businesses. And they are now getting on with this because they're finally getting some pretty clear signals coming from these meetings. And it will be them that need to spend on this and invest on it and change the way they do business in between. And I genuinely feel positive that that is starting to happen now at scale. And scale is the key word in all this.
Great, thank you, Robbie. Kripa, did you? And
Yeah,
then,
very
and then
quickly,
Jen.
can I just, yes, I would expect that as well, because there's quite a lot of businesses, and not just business. I mean, for example, again, GHD, when we did presentations with Australian Pavilion around hydrogen, we had immediate interest from countries like head of countries and so on, and those conversations took over, and that probably will land in terms of how we can help and other things. But in terms of, just to answer the question of what would be my expectation, is obviously these things I would expect that to be accelerated. I mean, because private sector is there, and equally I would like some advocates for nature people as well, so some development in that as well. So it's a balance at the end of the day. It's around, I think the conversation has gone beyond climate, it's sustainability, and then you start talking about social factors and environment factors as well. So my expectation would be to have that balance, and not simply focus on one part. So measurable. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kripa. Uchenna?
Yes, like I said, I'm excited what's having this experience. It's obvious that this particular COP28 made huge bang in terms of creating awareness, ensuring that every country, every individual, every stakeholder across the globe listens to the issue about climate change. However, there is need for, if we really want to make substantial progress, there's need for us to create a bigger platform to incorporate countries or people from the developing countries, those very poor countries who probably, based on their own political settings, or based on the leadership that's going on around in those countries, they're not able to catch up. They're not able to come up to what is happening at the global space. So there is need to reach out. There is need to ensure that every country is being carried along to really, because it's a global issue. It's a global impact. It affects every person. So there is need for that space to be created more. But obviously, this COP28 gave a more listening ear to a lot of issues, especially the issue about the food system and agriculture coming into play. Of course, it's a secular thing when you come to agriculture, because agriculture adds a lot or contributes a lot to the climate change, and contributing a lot to the climate change, it affects the system, the food system itself. So if we don't really address that level of secular issue, we continue having this problem over and over. So I'm happy that we had this opportunity, and I'm happy that food was brought into the mainstream of discussion in terms of climate change, and hopefully we can make progress, a lot of progress, by creating a bigger platform for other nations or other people to come into play. Thank you.
Thank you, Uchenna. Chelsea, did you have any views on kind of how we can build positive progress with a kind of ocean focus, as you were discussing?
Yeah, I think one thing that I took away from it is that I think it's really important actually that scientists work with businesses to make sure that, you know, knowledge is shared, that guidance is provided where perhaps, you know, sometimes solutions are put forward that sound sensible, but the scientists can be like, actually, hang on, you haven't thought about this feedback or this consequence. And, you know, I think for a lot of scientists, that's not a normal, or at least in the sort of ocean research space, it's not normal that you would normally work that closely with businesses. But I think we have to find a way to do that while sort of remaining impartial. And I think it's that kind of tension that needs to be progressed and sort of figured out. But I think it is really important that we share our knowledge and we guide this to make sure that it can be done in an equitable and safe way for the ocean.
Thank you, Chelsea. The next question, I think, is targeted for you, Kripa. So it's one of the key themes so far, and actually in all of your discussions, has been about the need to roll out finance. And obviously that's pertinent to our discussions just now. So how do we ensure that we're working to the same definitions of what constitutes green finance to avoid the potential for greenwash?
So that is a fantastic question. I must admit, you'll have to get into the details, but I can talk from a reporting perspective, and that could help give that answer. There's quite a lot around the need for common language around reporting, and that there are so many different organizations, and how it could be a challenge for anybody who's going to try and access those finance, could find themselves in a difficult situation. So the integration of like the ISSB, for example, the ESRS, and so I was sitting through that conversation around how CDP will now work with ESRS standards, for example. So that kind of gives that framework, if you like, and for climate finance or investors or anybody who is looking up at climate finance to be able to use that common framework, or as much as integrated framework, I would say, which would be a useful starting point. I hope that kind of answers this question, if not wholly. But yes, there's quite a lot of connection with reporting there.
Great, thank you, Kripa. And then one for you, I think, Chris. You mentioned unintended consequences, and I think a number of you did. Did you get the sense that targets and guidance are thinking along the lines of taking unintended consequences into account to avoid the uprise of greenwashing as opposed to actual improvements?
I think in answering that, there's two different elements to it. There is the, as Chelsea mentioned, there's the unintended consequences that are the scientific unintended consequences. That we need to be thinking about every outcome of an action and making sure that right throughout the value chain and the life cycle, those things are taken into consideration. How much that's being done at the moment and the targets, I'm not convinced there's too much thought about that, because the focus is on one thing and not right across the board at the moment. Clearly, there are catastrophic consequences of not dealing with climate change, but there are also other major consequences of dealing with it and dealing with it in the wrong way. And that is not necessarily something that is being widely thought about. The second part of that around greenwashing is coming on to the previous question, I guess, which is about using common language, using common definitions. This has got to help. And having, as Robbie mentioned, the finance mechanism starting to come into place and business starting to define terminology and government strategy starting to define exactly what we mean by these things is going to help to avoid greenwashing. I also think there's a lot of interest from business, and this is more of a personal perspective, there's a lot of interest from business and industry to not be greenwashing and not be seen to be greenwashing or fall into that trap. A lot of projects in Africa, for example, over the last 10 years are now being invested in by pension funds that actually want to be doing something positive and proactive. The days of going out and doing whatever you want are long gone. There is a very big change in how finance is run these days that's driving the agenda of not going down the route of doesn't matter, we can hide it. And there's a real appetite for making those changes. So I think that's a key point.
Great, thank you, Chris. Robbie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think just building on what both Crippa and Chris have said, I think in Europe we're very lucky because we have things like the European Union taxonomy, the EU taxonomy, and SFDR, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, which is starting to build that common language around kind of green terminology within the finance sector. And there isn't really such a thing as green finance. It's more, is that money invested in something that has made a green claim and that claim is substantiated, but also as the other guys have said here, also doesn't have unintended consequences. And that's looking at things like life cycle assessments and making sure that you are making the right decision. And inevitably wrong decisions will be made, but where we can understand these things up front and look at those indirect impacts of potentially solving an environmental issue but creating a social one, or flipping it from one stage of the life cycle, solving one stage and then pushing the problem to a different stage. We need to try and understand that as best we can in that kind of upfront due diligence, so to speak, as part of those green investments. But we are seeing that market change. And if you can show people, if they invest in a building, as a good example, X million or whatever it might be to completely reposition a building, and you can show at the end of it that building achieves a state of being defined as highly efficient from an energy perspective, that gives you a very clear outcome which has a value, which means people are likely to invest in it. So it's not just about the greenwashing piece, it's about giving people very clear definitions of what success looks like, because you can't invest in something unless you're sure you've achieved it. And at the moment, that's been the big gap across not just the built environment, but most sectors, of agreement of what is good, what does leadership look like. And we're starting to see that emerge at scale across Europe, and we're even starting to see it come out into the US with things like zero emission buildings. So really exciting space. And again, that pushes the anti-greenwashing thing in the right direction, but it also pushes that change in between the COPs in the right direction.
Great, thank you very much, Robbie. That's really useful. Uchenna, I wonder if I could ask you, thinking about the kind of food systems and agriculture side of things, how do you think the outcomes of COP28 will affect what environmental professionals in this sector are doing on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, it's going to affect them seriously. Generally, in our practice professionally, most of the issues that has to do with sustainable food system were not put in place. So for now, one of the best outcomes that are coming out from this COP28 is mainstreaming that into what we do as professionals. It will help a lot in terms of our practices, in terms of our technical support to other sectors, including that of agri-food sector. So it's going to really change a lot of narrative. It's going to really change our engagement styles. So that is a huge addition to our professional practices for me.
Thank you very much. And Chelsea, a kind of specific question related to the ocean environment. So obviously ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, blue carbon habitats are going to be very important for that, including things like seagrass and salt marsh. I wonder if you have any views on how we can ensure the longevity of some of these habitats, given the changes that are going to take place in the ocean due to climate change. Has there been much research done on those areas?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of momentum around blue carbon in the last few years. It really has. I think if you'd asked most people 5 years ago, they probably wouldn't have known, might never have heard of it before. It is gaining some momentum now. And actually, this is a bit of a UK perspective, but actually the sort of policy and government has taken quite an interest in sort of protecting blue carbon habitats, and actually in some cases looking at possible sort of restoration. And there's lots of benefits with blue carbon. So although it's one of the smaller size contributions to carbon dioxide removal, but it has lots of co-benefits. So for biodiversity, sort of like flood resilience, there's lots of other things in relation to climate change that protecting these environments is actually really important for. And I think that there has been lots of research on how these ecosystems will be impacted by climate change. So I think now is a good time for them to be getting attention and making sure that there's already been some degradation of these environments. So let's not take that any further. Let's stop now and then try and protect what's there. And, if it's possible, try and enhance or enhance their capability as well. So that's one of the approaches where it's definitely more of a nature-based solution because it does this naturally. And there's lots of other nature-related and society-related co-benefits as well. So in terms of the ocean space, that's the approach that has had the most attention and has a lot of support behind it, which is really great to see.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. And a massive thank you to all our attendees for putting all those questions in. I'm so sorry I couldn't get through all of them, but thank you to all our panelists for writing responses in there. And I will share those along with the recording so that people can read through them afterwards. Just to end things, I'm afraid I'm going to surprise you all now with just a final question for all of our attendees. So just really short, which is, what is a key outcome that you would like to see from COP29? So thinking about later this year. Sorry, Robbie, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to go through our speakers in order.
I think it's that common language piece, which is the missing thing. I see this at scale. We've got a virtual city, nearly 150 billion AUM. We know what we need to do. It's unsticking that as often the common language piece. So I think now that we've got that direction of travel out of COP28, business involved at COP26, I'd like to see COP29 really start to ratify that common language so we have something we can all do business with. Thank you, Robbie. Kripa.
I would say it's more that making that connection between Conding Montreal Protocol, GBF, and COP. The conversation around climate and making it even more solid. So we see it as a holistic problem rather than separate ones. Thank you. Uchenna.
Yes, I want to see a more transparent engagement by all stakeholders, especially those from the developed countries, so that we'll have better impact across board. The truth of the matter is the impact of climate change affects more on the developing countries because of their level of resilience. So I want to see a better engagement in terms of transparency, in terms of transparency in delivering the much talks. So let's see the actions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chris.
Focus on finance and access to finance, get the money flowing in the right directions to the right projects.
Amazing, thank you. And Chelsea?
I think for me, it'd be sort of raising the profile of sort of ocean observations a bit further. So like I mentioned, they're not currently accounted for in the global stocktake. And I think that's a big gap that we need to consider the ocean as an important part of those type of processes. So that would be my hope.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. That's been so useful to get all of your perspectives working in different areas of the environmental sector and some of those key focuses moving forward for the year. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all our attendees as well for logging in. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance using the IES CPD tool in the members area of the website. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. And if you are watching the recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content.